Hey, what's up everyone? Hope you're all having a great day. Balance is always a popular topic of discussion in many games, where players will constantly talk about how certain things are unbalanced or overpowered, and how certain aspects of the game need to be fixed. In particular, games that are asymmetrical, in which opposing players might have different access to different tools, naturally encourage these kinds of discussions. Balance is one of those problems where it's easy to describe why or that something is the wrong answer, but it's very difficult to come up with the right answer. In a game like Overwatch, players can choose different heroes which are all designed very differently, and inevitably, certain heroes are always going to be seen by the community as being under or overpowered, and therefore in need of being addressed. Blizzard is often criticized for certain design decisions, of which I am one of those critics, and there's no shortage of videos or forum posts talking about how Blizzard sucks at balancing, and how if they just did such and such change, then the game would be better. But today I wanted to introduce a perspective that I don't really hear a lot in the community, which is the idea that the game will never be truly balanced, and that perfect hero balancing is probably impossible. Now you might be wondering, is the point of the video just to suggest that certain problems are too difficult and therefore we should give up and just be content with what we have? And of course the answer is no. The reason I want to introduce this idea is that sometimes I think the community can be a bit unrealistic with certain expectations when it comes to balance. That's not to say that I want to defend any particular balance decision from Blizzard or that there aren't reasonable improvements that can be made, but if our goal is to improve the experience of the game, we should at the very least try to understand what the limitations actually are, which will then hopefully allow us to discuss the game in a more productive way. To be more specific, I think one of the expectations that part of the community has is that the game should strive to make every hero viable against every other hero on every map, at every skill level, and in every situation. While yes, this would be the definition of perfection that on paper we might want to move towards, if this is what we're hoping for in reality, I think we're simply setting ourselves up for disappointment. If we believe the average forum post talking about hero balance, you might be led to believe that balance is just so simple, and that changes are really obvious. If Blizzard just changed this and that, the game would be perfect. In reality, balance is a difficult problem, and I think this is true for two fundamental reasons: the mathematical complexity of the game, and the diversity of player experience. It's no mystery that Overwatch is a complex game. Currently, there are 39 unique heroes in the game, with the most recent one being Mauga. Hero choice is not the only thing that makes a game complex, but it is the primary concern of balance. The word balance in general is used to refer to the relative power of heroes. The key phrase relative power is an important one, and how you choose to define it determines how difficult the problem of balance is going to be. Without a lot of thought, we could say that 39 doesn't sound like a very big number. Maybe it's not small, but surely with only 39 heroes, that's only 39 different things you need to do in order to balance the game. A simplistic and naive approach to balancing a hero could be to simply define its power by its win rate. You look at the hero's win rate across the very many games in which they are played, and change the numbers depending on whether it's higher or lower than 50%. If it's lower than 50%, then you buff the hero, and if it's higher, then you nerf. If this is how we define balance, then on paper, Overwatch is actually not that bad. If you look up the win rates of all heroes across all ranks, pretty much all of them hover around 45 to 55%. While win rate is a useful statistic, it's commonly said that win rate doesn't tell the entire story of how a hero feels to play. This is because the overall win rate only paints a picture of the average success of a hero across every situation. But when it comes to averages, the number itself doesn't really tell you anything about how a hero is going to play in any given game, which could potentially be really poorly. Just as an extreme example, suppose a hero had a 100% win rate in certain situations and a 0% win rate in other ones. Of course, this would be pretty bad, but it could still appear as a 50% win rate. What this means is that true balancing isn't quite as simple as just tuning the numbers until you reach 50%. In a perfect world, all heroes would have 50% win rates, but being at 50% doesn't necessarily imply that the hero is perfectly balanced. The game, and particularly certain matchups, can feel really unbalanced, even if a certain hero appears to be balanced on average. So balance might be a bit harder than we think, as it's not just 39 heroes we need to balance. As many players correctly point out, the devs can't just chase win rates, they need to more precisely tune heroes with respect to specific matchups. Which sounds relatively simple, but how much harder does the problem really get if we phrase it this way? This question is what you could call a combinatorial problem. Combinatorics is a mathematical field of study dedicated to counting things, and the question we want to ask is how many matchups do we need to balance if we have 39 heroes? Conveniently, there is a formula used to calculate what's called a binomial coefficient that we can use to answer this question. The formula tells us how many unique ways there are to choose a specific number of things out of a fixed set of choices. In our situation, out of a total set of 39 heroes, there happen to be 741 possible non-mirrored matchups. Immediately, we can see that the problem of balancing becomes significantly more difficult if we need to concern ourselves with specific matchups rather than just heroes. But again, the problem of balancing doesn't just stop here. Many players point out that we can't just look at specific matchups because Overwatch isn't a 1v1 game. Sometimes the balance of a hero depends on how it synergizes with other heroes on the same team. And so it's not just specific heroes we need to worry about, we also need to worry about the possible team compositions. So out of 39 heroes, we want to ask, how many team compositions are there? Well, we can again use the same formula that allowed us to calculate the number of matchups. Out of 39 heroes, if we need to pick 5 to put on a team, there would be 575,757 possible team compositions. Now, some of you might have already noticed that I might have made a mistake. Surely Overwatch compositions are not that diverse because you can't just pick any 5 heroes to put on a team. Unless, of course, you happen to be playing open queue. If we take role queue into account, there are currently 12 tank heroes, 17 damage heroes, and 10 support heroes, of which we need to choose 1, 2, and 2 respectively. We can simply apply the formula to each role individually and multiply the combinations, yielding 73,440 unique compositions. From this, it might be obvious why the Balanced team decided to move from open queue to role queue. At the cost of creativity, the game is orders of magnitude easier to balance once you introduce role locks, because there are significantly less ways that team compositions can be broken. If you're curious and you're wondering how many compositions there would be if Overwatch was still 6v6 open queue, the number is 3,262,623 possible team compositions. Of course, we again have to consider that Overwatch is not a 5-person co-op game, and we want to know how many non-mirrored 5v5 games are possible. From 73,440 team compositions, there are 2,696,680,080 5v5 matchups. And if we want to get really balanced, we might also want to multiply this number by the number of maps, since maps have a big effect on what type of compositions might be viable. And with 32 maps, there are over 86 billion unique ways the game can be played. And if you really want to get balanced, you have to divide the maps into their various subsections, like the different checkpoints on Escort and Hybrid, and the capture points on Control and Flashpoint. In that case, there are 84 subsections, of which then there are over 226 billion ways the game can be played. From this, we can see why balance is a difficult problem. Now, of course, it doesn't excuse bad balancing decisions, because even in impossible problems, there can be varying degrees of success. But we can see that even if we had the best game designers who have ever lived, Overwatch is by its nature unlikely to ever be truly balanced and always going to favor specific heroes in specific situations. Combine this with the fact that Overwatch is supposed to be an evolving game trying to constantly keep things new and interesting with consistent additions and changes to the heroes and map pools, the difficulty of the problem is likely to outpace the rate at which you can solve it. Every time you change or add a new hero, it can significantly change the balancing in ways that you might not expect. The power of a particular hero is in many ways relative to the state of the other heroes, and so changes to one can inadvertently result in other heroes becoming weaker or stronger. As an example, let's take Ana. If we change Ana's anti-nade, this actually has a very big effect on the balancing of Kiriko, even if nothing about Kiriko changes. When anti-nade is strong, Kiriko's Suzu naturally gets more value, and therefore is also strong. What this means is that nerfing or buffing one thing will immediately change the balancing of other things that it's related to. The relationship between heroes and team compositions is a complex network. Every time you try to correct the balance of one hero, you will probably end up breaking the balance of another. Now, of course, enumerating every single team composition across every possible subsection of every map in order to suggest that balance can't be perfect is probably a bit unnecessarily dramatic and overly pessimistic. My intention is only to accurately describe the problem so that we can temper our expectations, but surely, no player actually expects the developer to achieve perfection. We just want the game to be at a level where heroes are at the very least minimally viable in as many situations as possible. Naturally, if we can't reach perfection, we can at least hope for an approximation, but unfortunately, this runs into the second problem, which is the diversity of player experience. Sometimes there are multiple different answers to the same problem that depend on what your variables are. Perhaps the most important variable related to player experience is skill level, and undoubtedly, skill level very significantly affects your perspective on balance. And so even if we can come up with good approximations for balancing the game, we have to answer the question of who the approximation is going to be based on. This is the age-old question of should the game be balanced for the best players, the worst players, or the average players? A pragmatic and important question, especially if you're Blizzard and one of your primary goals is to ensure that the game is popular and profitable. In the online community, you'll find supporters of all three perspectives, each making their arguments about why their perspective is the right one. A less popular opinion is that the game should be balanced bottom-up, around lower elos or around newer players. If you want to attract newer players, maybe this is the best way to do it, since if you make the game as approachable as possible, you might have a chance of generating a larger player base. This philosophy is probably a better fit for a mobile game and is probably not a good approach for Overwatch, since player retention is also important, and you don't want the experience of newer players to get worse as they improve at the game. If you listen to content creators and streamers who in general are going to be on the upper end of the skill spectrum, you'll almost certainly get opinions that are biased towards balancing the game around average to higher elos. If you read forum posts and YouTube comments, you'll also get low to average elo opinions of the game, since that's going to be most of the player population. The argument in support of balancing strictly around high levels is that Overwatch is a competitive game at its core, and so it just makes sense to balance the game around players who are actually utilizing their heroes to their full extent, within the bounds of human limitations, since that is the most accurate image of a hero's actual power level. If you look to lower skill levels to make balance changes, it disrupts the balance at the upper end of the spectrum, potentially ruining the competitive integrity of the game. Maybe it's the case that Blizzard should aim to respect the players who promote their game and who are the most dedicated to mastering it. That's surely not an unreasonable perspective, but the most obvious counterargument is not one of functionality, but one of practicality. The population of players who are capable of fully utilizing the power of various heroes is a rather small one, and is at a skill level that most players will never even reach. At the end of the day, the game needs to attract an audience because it needs to be profitable, and therefore it needs to be fun for most people. As such, maybe we shouldn't balance the game around high elo, since relatively speaking, quote-unquote, nobody plays at that level anyway. High-elo games aren't representative of the experience of most players, and therefore shouldn't be the primary motivation for balance, since if the game isn't enjoyable for the majority, there wouldn't be a game to be good at anyway. Instead, one might say that the game should be balanced around average skill levels like Gold, in order to appeal to as many players as possible. This is a rather utilitarian approach where the decisions are made to benefit the greatest number of people, and as a now free-to-play game, that perspective certainly holds more weight for Blizzard. While in an ideal world, we would want everyone to have an optimal experience, unfortunately, these perspectives are difficult and perhaps impossible to make entirely compatible. Changes that create better balance on one side of the spectrum often cause unbalance on the other side. And we can see that the balance team have in some ways submitted themselves to this fact. Reinhardt is notorious for underperforming at higher levels of play, but has been left alone for the longest time, precisely because he overperforms at lower levels. Sojourn is notorious for being one of the best DPSs in the game, and yet receives buffs because she underperforms even in Grandmaster. There just isn't really an easy answer to this problem. It's almost inevitable that regardless of how many buffs or nerfs you do, some handful of heroes will always rise above the rest and differ across the spectrum of skill, making the game impossible to balance for everyone. In theory, one way to make this problem a bit easier to solve would be to more closely match the skill curves of every hero, such that given a certain amount of skill, every hero should get a similar amount of value. If you've experienced climbing up the skill ladder, you've probably realized that certain heroes just simply start to fall off the higher you go, and previously ineffective heroes can start to become more practical as well. The primary limiting factor for a hero's effectiveness at lower skill levels is often difficulty, and in contrast, at higher skill levels, is potential ability, which is a combination of the natural limitations of a hero's kit and their stats. Naturally, this is why players of different skill levels tend to gravitate towards different heroes. If balance is the only goal, heroes that are strong at lower skill levels and weak at higher levels could be better balanced by increasing their stats while simultaneously increasing their difficulty. In the opposite case, where heroes are weak at lower skill levels while strong at higher levels, it could be better balanced by decreasing stats while also decreasing their difficulty. But unfortunately, when it comes to optimizing player experience, there is yet another dimension of game design that we have to consider, which again ultimately makes the game very difficult to balance. It's the human elements of game design, which is that the game needs to be fun. Different players define fun differently, and even if it were the case that we could match the skill curves of every hero, it wouldn't necessarily be the case that everyone would immediately find the game to be in its most enjoyable state. Some high elo player would probably think that the skill curve is too flat, and some low elo player would probably have the opposite opinion and believe that the skill curve is too steep. Everyone says that they would like the game to be perfectly balanced, but does a perfectly balanced game actually lead to something that is perceived as being more fun? Many of the elements that make the game more fun aren't always things that will necessarily make the game more balanced, and in fact, oftentimes, lead to the opposite. Going back to the issue of skill levels, players generally want their hero to feel effective in their own hands, but this means different things to different players. If it were up to the more hardcore players, maybe every hero should be as difficult as Tracer. If it were up to more casual players, maybe every hero should be as easy as Moira. According to some, Moira needs more skill expression in order to be worth playing, and according to others, Tracer needs less. Players might say that they want the game to be balanced, but in reality, the changes that might actually accomplish this most likely wouldn't be received very well either. And so as a compromise, the solution that most games implement is simply allowing both kinds of heroes to exist, so that both sides have things that are considered fun. This necessarily implies that something has to be unbalanced for everyone. It's fairly obvious that by design, certain heroes are just meant for certain skill levels, which unfortunately means that sometimes there are just certain heroes that you aren't quote-unquote supposed to play. In addition, there's also the mentality that the game needs to change every so often in order to keep things interesting. New maps, new modes, new heroes, new reworks, and new game mechanics. While content is nice, constant changes once again make it very difficult to keep the game in a state of balance if one exists. For many players, content is what keeps them coming back, and many players are able to overlook balance issues in favor of having something new and fun. Not only that, but different players naturally favor different kinds of metas, which means that the game is usually the most fun for a subset of people precisely when the game is unbalanced, favoring their playstyle for their favorite hero. Inevitably, people are biased, and so even if the game could be in a hypothetical state of perfect balance, everyone would simply think that the game isn't fun because their favorite hero isn't particularly strong, or because their most hated hero isn't weak enough. Not to mention that a game that's balanced is a game without a meta, and therefore would eventually be perceived as a game that's apparently boring and stale. Someone, somewhere is always going to be unhappy with the state of the game, and so naturally there's not a lot of motivation to spend too much effort balancing the game, because in some ways it's not even the primary element of the game that keeps it interesting for most people. And so the pragmatic solution is just to leave the game unbalanced, but allow different heroes and playstyles to cycle in and out of the meta. In theory, giving every player their time in the spotlight. So in conclusion, balance is probably impossible because it's fundamentally a difficult problem due to the complexity of the game. Different players experience balance in different ways, and there's an inherent motivation to prioritize other conflicting goals. That's all I have to say for now. Feel free to let me know your thoughts about the idea of balance. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.